What if Christianity is responding to something deeper than even guilt? Welcome to Trouble in Paradise, a podcast exploring how Eastern Orthodoxy understands humanity's fall and how that understanding reshapes the entire Christian story. This podcast exists because there was a time when exploring Orthodoxy didn't just challenge my theology, it disoriented my faith. The more I tried to understand Orthodoxy, the more unsettled I became. And eventually that confusion stopped feeling academic, it started feeling existential. I wasn't just afraid of being wrong about a doctrine. I was afraid that if the framework I had always relied upon collapsed, I might lose Christianity itself. Questioning original sin didn't feel like adjusting a theological opinion for me. It felt like my spiritual world was coming undone. Original sin wasn't just one doctrine in a larger system. It was at the root of the system. It explained election. It explained why salvation had to belong entirely to God. It felt like it protected the glory of God from being shared with human effort. So when that framework started to feel unstable, it didn't feel like I was reconsidering one belief. It felt like I was standing at the edge of losing Christianity itself. Orthodoxy didn't feel confusing because it lacked answers. It felt confusing because I was trying to understand it through assumptions I didn't yet know how to question, assumptions shaped by the doctrine of original sin. Until those assumptions were examined, Orthodoxy simply couldn't make sense to me. Eventually, I reached a point where I realized that if I was going to be intellectually honest, I couldn't keep studying Orthodoxy from a distance. I had to try to understand it from the inside. And that was difficult for me because Orthodoxy preserves much of its theology inside its liturgical life. It isn't just expressed through systematic theology or academic writing. It is prayed, sung, and lived through worship. And stepping into that world felt deeply unfamiliar and, at times, deeply uncomfortable. I carried a lot of resistance with me. At the time, I struggled with icons. I struggled with the way the saints were spoken about. I struggled especially with how Orthodoxy spoke about the Virgin Mary. From where I stood, some of it felt dangerously close to blasphemy. And I remember reaching a moment where I realized that I was facing a kind of last internal test. I thought, if Orthodoxy has actually preserved the gospel, if their understanding of salvation, the fall, and Christ's work is faithful to apostolic Christianity, then it means I might be wrong about the gospel itself. And if I was wrong about the gospel, then it was very possible I was wrong about those other things too. That realization was not comfortable. And it was in the middle of that tension that I encountered a book by Father John Romanides called Ancestral Sin. Romanides wasn't simply critiquing Western theology. He was presenting a completely different diagnosis of the human condition. Instead of describing the fall primarily in terms of inherited guilt or total depravity, he described humanity as inheriting death, corruption, and bondage to spiritual powers. And when I encountered that idea, my reaction wasn't relief. It was more like panic. I remember thinking, how can Christianity even function without original sin? What is the gospel supposed to be? What exactly is Christ saving us from? Those questions didn't go away quickly. I wrestled with them for weeks, sometimes hours a day, turning them over, arguing with them, trying to see whether this Orthodox framework could actually explain Scripture, human behavior, and the Christian story. And slowly something began to make sense. If death truly entered the human condition through the fall, if corruption and mortality became the environment humanity lives in, then fear of death becomes unavoidable. And fear of death drives self-preservation. Self-preservation becomes selfishness. Selfishness leads to sin. Sin deepens alienation. Alienation reinforces the power of death. In that light, sin isn't the starting point of the human problem. It's the symptom. In the Western framework I grew up with, the gospel often started and centered on legal categories: guilt, punishment, forgiveness, justification. Those themes are biblical and important, but Orthodoxy seemed to place them inside a larger story, a story where Christ comes not only to forgive sin, but to heal humanity, to destroy death, to defeat the devil, to restore communion between God and creation. And that vision didn't make the gospel smaller, it made it bigger. Over this series, we're going to explore how these different understandings of the fall developed historically, how they shaped Western Christianity, and how Orthodoxy preserves a different theological starting point. But to understand any of that, we have to begin where the Christian story begins, in paradise. Because until we understand what humanity was created for, we can't understand what humanity lost. And until we understand what humanity lost, we can't understand what Christ came to restore.